My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
We need to use diplomacy and build international consensus to resolve our problems whenever possible.
Our diplomats are working with a range of partners to strengthen human rights protections.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
And today, in our boasted modern civilization,
Sometimes, Instagram posts of historical photos go viral. There are so-called Twitter historians with hundreds of thousands of followers. In other cases, newsworthy historical articles in mainstream media outlets garner large numbers of clicks. The rise of Web 2.0 and the incentives that went along with it, besides creating social media giants, changed the way that people research, write, and read history. In his new book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past, historian Jason Steinhauer calls this phenomenon e-history. In his book, he takes a deep dive into how the web has changed what type of history we view online and how we view it. He also takes a look at what might lie ahead. What does all of this mean for historians and historical studies? Is it creating a world full of students and citizens with a greater historical knowledge? What possible connection does it have to future foreign policy making? Jason is currently a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a contributor to Time and CNN, a past editorial board member of the Washington Post Made by History section, and a presidential counselor of the National WWII Museum. He worked for 7 years at the U.S. Library of Congress. In 2020, he founded the History Club on Clubhouse, which he hosts regularly. The club has more than 100,000 members and averages 2,500 participants per week. Let's have a listen to the conversation. Welcome to a special bonus episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And along with us today, I have a friend of mine, Jason Steinhauer, who is going to talk to us about his new book, History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. I'm excited to be a bonus. I feel like, a bonus is something beyond what you expect. So I'm pleased to be sort of beyond expectations.
As you should be. We only save the best for our bonus episodes. I really enjoyed the book. I found it very insightful, useful, timely, for all the reasons we're going to talk about here over the course of this episode. Your book revolves around what you term e-history, and I'm hoping that you can explain to our audience a little bit about what you mean by e-history and how it's different from traditional history.
So first, I'll just read from the introduction to the book, which actually defines e-history. That way I'll get my own definition correct. So I call e-history in the book, I say it is a discrete media product that packages an element or elements of the past for consumption on the social web, and which tries to leverage the social web in order to gain visibility. So that's a mouthful. So what do we mean by that? Well, the book is called History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. And the question that really motivated the book for me was, why does certain information about history or the past become visible online, and why does some other information about the past never reach our eyes? Why does some information rise to the top of the feeds, and why does there some information we never see? This can be applied to science and news and politics, but I wanted to particularly address this question of history. The more I looked into that question, and the more I thought about it, the more I talked to people, the more I researched, I kind of came to the conclusion, and I argue this in the book, that there are really fundamental underpinnings, underlying values that are sort of clashing when it comes to the transposition or transposing of history onto the social web. And I talk about this in chapter 2 of the book. And this is setting up what e-history is. So traditionally, we might think of history as being expert-centric, right? It revolves around some level of expertise. History is a time-consuming exercise. It takes years to write an article or to write a book. This book took 5.5 years. And history is deemed to be sort of intrinsically valuable by those who practice it. In other words, history is supposed to be valuable to society, even if we can't always articulate what that value is. Well, the web, and the social web in particular, works under a very different set of premises and underlying values. So the web is not expert-centric, it is user-centric. It doesn't privilege the information of experts, it privileges the experience of users, whether those users are experts or not. And the web is also designed to deliver you instantly gratifying results. So the search engines try to give you the fastest information right away. Social media tries to surface things to you. They're going to be immediately relevant, and that'll get you to stay on the platforms. And the web kind of works on this market logic where things are only valuable if a lot of people are looking at them, or if they're getting a lot of clicks, or they're getting a lot of follows, or they're getting a lot of views. So it's sort of extrinsically valuable. So I argue in the book that you have this clash of values between extrinsic and intrinsic, between user-centric and expert-centric. And so the way that you bridge that gap is through what I call e-history. And e-history is this sort of evolution of communicating history, and it takes place on the social web, and it tries to leverage the social web, the mechanics of it, the tools of it, and also adhere to the values of the social web in order to get historical information or information about the past in front of our eyes, regardless of who created that information. And in the book, I talk about how e-history is created by professional historians, by journalists, by disinformation agents, by people who just have a casual interest in history. All of that competes under this moniker or this nickname of e-history for our attention. And the e-history that aligns with the values of the social web turned out to be the ones that we see the most.
Yeah, and kind of going off your last point there, can you explain a little bit more about, over the past couple decades that you highlight in this book, how the creation and dissemination tactics of e-history, why they matter? And I'm speaking here about, you talk a lot about in the book about going viral, whether or not that's on Twitter or a news story or something that gets a lot of traction via social media. And you talk about how things have become to be created specifically for that, their ability to be disseminated more broadly, and how that affects the type of history that's created, and just sort of what types of history we see on this. And it was funny. My wife asked Alexa a question the other day that was historical in nature, and I never, I looked at it in a completely different way now, because I'm like, that's, and she said something like, this is coming from Amazon Answers or something like that. But it was, yeah, I'm looking at all of that in a different way now.
Well, that's awesome. That's a very high compliment, because that's the whole point of this book. So that's awesome to hear that little anecdote. But yes, exactly to your point, right? Why does this matter? Because it's all around us. It's infiltrated all of our lives in ways that we don't always realize until we stop and think about it. One of the questions that I wanted to answer as I started to write this book was, has all of this e-history actually led to a better understanding of history? And I came to the conclusion that it has not. Actually, the real influence of all this is that it has deeper embedded the values of the social web further into our lives. So basically, the conventions of e-history have now come to represent all history, and we only value the things that align with this set of values. So what do I mean by that? Well, you talked about virality, right? So one of the ways that e-history becomes visible on the web is by going viral through a network, whether that's on Twitter or whether that's on YouTube. That doesn't privilege the accuracy of information. It privileges the ability to get people's attention and to send signals through social networks that you should pay attention to something. So what does that incentivize people to do? It incentivizes them to create information about the past that will purposefully go viral. And I talk about this in the book. There's a famous account called History and Pics, which did this. There's other accounts that do it as well. Because we reward virality with so much influence, whether it be money, power, attention, social acclaim, critical acclaim, media coverage, etc. So this whole ecosystem that we've created that sort of privileges and incentivizes certain behaviors, that ends up having consequences for the types of information that we see, the types of information that we think are publicly valuable. And then the more that happens, the more we accept it, the more it becomes just a part of our everyday life. And so we now are paying attention to histories that go viral, whether or not they are accurate or not, complete or not, thorough or not. And we give them attention, we give them media coverage because of their ability to go viral through a network, not necessarily how good of an understanding they give us of a particular phenomenon.
Yeah, and just to be specific, and in case anyone was wondering, my 6-year-old son asked where donuts came from. Very serious historical question. And according to Alexa, they're Danish in origin. So I don't know if that's accurate or not, but that's what Alexa told us.
And just to that point, right, one of my chapters in the book is about the crowdsource past. And so Amazon has a whole crowdsourcing platform, Amazon Answers, and a lot of the crowdsourced information from that goes in towards Alexa. Also, Amazon takes a lot of information from Wikipedia, which is also a crowdsourced platform. So these crowdsourced knowledge platforms that have been created in Web 2.0 are now informing the information we get on Web 3.0. And that's one of the things I talked about at the end of the book. So one of the points of writing this book was to show how it's not like these platforms only live in one particular place on the web or occupy one piece of real estate in cyberspace. Their tentacles extend across the web, and as the web encroaches deeper into our lives, they'll start to show up in our homes, in our living rooms, in our cars, in our ovens. You can imagine smart ovens in the future. You ask your smart oven, where does bread come from, or where does donuts come from? And it gives you an answer. And that answer comes from Quora, or it comes from Amazon, or it comes from Wikipedia. So this stuff builds on top of itself. And we have all been complicit in creating this universe of e-history that is now spreading across our lives. And to be honest, there are some people who have no problem with that, and that's fine. But then there are other people who have concerns about it. I'm probably in the camp that has some concerns about it.
Yeah, and then your smart oven gives you a bread recipe and then preheats your oven as well. So, and I'm glad you went to that crowdsourced aspect of this, because I was going to touch on that a little bit as you were talking about the way people use it and what they use and everything, as far as e-history and where they go to get that. But I found it interesting in the book when you talked about the snowstorm of 2016 and the fact that because there was so much real-time information about it, because Wikipedia had been a thing for a decade at that point, the page for that snowstorm is massive, comparatively speaking to other snowstorms that may have been much larger, much more of consequence for people and issues on the East Coast. And that all has to do with just the nature of e-history at that point and crowdsourcing history. And it just, I found that to be a fascinating point and something that's really important to think about when you think about not only what people are seeing now, but what people in the future will have as a resource for history, and looking at that and saying like, oh, this snowstorm in 2016, this Wikipedia entry is huge. So this must have really affected life in a major way for a week or so. And when in reality, there was a whole lot of people crowdsourcing it, and they had, tweets from the Virginia Department of Transportation saying when they were closing roads and things that you might not have had 20 years ago to be able to input that into the system. And I just, that kind of really put it into perspective for me in an interesting way.
Yeah, one of the themes throughout the book I kept coming back to was how e-history and the incentives and the mechanics of the social web, they create a lot of enthusiasm, but that doesn't necessarily equate with significance, right? And those two things get very conflated in the online environment. And so there will be a lot of enthusiasm to respond to something that is happening, a piece of breaking news, something that seems consequential at the moment. Again, because the system incentivizes it. And if you can sort of ride that wave, it can give you more visibility. It can make you famous. It can give you your 15 minutes of fame. It can make you feel like you contributed to something important. There's all kinds of reasons why that happens. But whether it's on Wikipedia or whether it's on Instagram, later in the book, I talked about the event that happened at the mall in 2019, the encounter between the student from Covington High School and the indigenous protester, and the sort of enthusiasm and the frenzy that ensued on social media afterwards to throw these historical memes into the conversation in order to prove a point without even asking where those memes had come from, some of them being created by Russian disinformation agents and other actors who had nefarious intentions. But it's the ecosystem that we've all collectively created and incentivized privileges this sort of frenzied activity, this enthusiasm, this rush to grab available memes or imagery or information from all corners of the web and throw it up online in these e-history formats. And my argument in the book is that actually doesn't help us understand anything any better. It actually just, again, further pushes us towards this type of behavior because we feel like we get rewarded for it, either through some kind of dopamine hit from being part of this activity or by actors within the media ecosystem that elevate our content so that people will see it.
A lot of this that you talk about what's sort of playing in the media at any given moment or anything that helps drive virality leads to another part of the book that I thought was interesting, and something that I discuss in some of my classes I teach at Georgetown. And one of those classes is actually sort of how to write for the real world, and my students learn how to write op-eds or blog posts, things of that nature. And I've written stuff that would be quote newsworthy kind of history and things like that before. But what do you mean when you say the newsworthy sort of things that are kind of coming to the fore these days, and more historians and others, not necessarily historians, as you comment in here, right? And also the notion of sort of storytelling as well that kind of ties into that I thought was fascinating. If you could talk about those a little bit.
Yeah, so the book, once I sort of set up e-history and this clash of values between maybe traditional history and the social web, I try to look at different mechanisms by which information about the past becomes visible online. And so one of that is crowdsource information. Another is virality. Another is visually arresting. So there can be visually arresting imagery about the past that sort of stops you from scrolling and causes you to take notice. And then as the book moves on, I talk about something that I call the Newsworthy Pass. So history that can be pegged to the news cycle stands a better chance of becoming visible in people's feeds than history that cannot be pegged to the news cycle. And as historians, we know this drill because when you pitch editors at news publications and you want to write about something historical, the first question they'll ask you is, can you peg it to a news story or a headline, right? And oftentimes you'll get rejected because it's not newsworthy enough or it doesn't have enough of a sort of current events angle. And so that prevents certain history from reaching the public sphere. But if you can find a newsworthy hook or a news peg that will allow information about the past to become visible online and on the social web because it'll get pushed out by journalists on Twitter and other places. So the newsworthy past, pegging the past or elements of history to something that's happening in the news cycle becomes one mechanism by which history becomes visible on the web. And so I, again, sort of wanted to ask the question of, well, what is that really doing? Is that actually teaching us anything about history? And I'm not convinced that it is. I think one of the things that it's doing, and I found evidence for this, is it's actually conflating the distinction between historians and journalists. So much to the point that if you talk to people who are not in these fields, but who consume information via news outlets, they oftentimes can't tell the difference between a historian and a journalist. And they oftentimes can't tell the difference either between a journalist and an op-ed contributor, which is a whole other thing. And so that raises, I think, all kinds of questions for the professional discipline of history. It also shows how journalists have been encroaching on the professional discipline of history, even at a time where journalists have been complaining about people encroaching on their profession. So at the same time, journalists are worried about people who don't have journalism backgrounds calling themselves reporters. Reporters are stepping into the realm of history, even without having history backgrounds, and calling themselves historians, which I find to be a bit ironic. The other thing, of course, is that I think this really forces history more and more to be a presentist sort of discipline. In other words, the only time you're allowed to speak about the past in the public sphere is if you can relate it to something happening in the present, which of course seems to me to be the opposite of what history is supposed to be, because it's supposed to be about the past. So I think there's a lot of questions about this newsworthy past and what it's doing, both to the field and to the public understanding of history. I hope that my book can sort of start that conversation. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think it's a worthwhile conversation to have.
Yeah, and as you note, it's kind of it's a touchy subject among historians, right? There's those that don't think historians should ever write anything that has any kind of hook to current news or act in sort of that presentist way, while there's others that do that all the time. You see analogies constantly being tossed around, and is it a new Cold War with China? is analogies with what's going on in Ukraine right now, and analogies between Vietnam and Afghanistan, and the way we pulled out of there and stuff. And it's just, I think someone that has a broader historical sensibility can understand that there are no perfect analogies, that it all depends on what you're looking at, and the history has that opaqueness to it, and the complexity to it that oftentimes get left out, which you mentioned in the book when you're writing something that's a newsworthy history piece. I mean, that's part of the problem. You can't include all of the complexity of history in 800 words.
And similar to the point we were making earlier, the newsworthy past often creates a lot of enthusiasm, but the question is, does it create a lot of significance, right? So when a news item is breaking, there's this rush among editors and scholars to write something about it because you want to seize on the opportunity. You want your expertise to be out there. And the question is, what is the end result of that? And is there actually any significant change to policy, to public understandings of things when that happens? Or is it just you're responding to the incentives that are baked into the current media ecosystem to try to get your name and work out there? And this is where I think history communication could learn a lot from science communication, because science communication has actually done studies around this. And one interesting study I found in researching the book was that during the Bush administration, there was this rush of public writing by scientists who wanted to speak out against Bush and his perceived anti-science policies. And so science communication saw a little bit of a burst of enthusiasm in a similar way that history communication has seen a burst of enthusiasm during the Trump administration. But when science communication scholars went back and looked at it, they found that actually the number one motivating factors for scientists who engaged with the public during that period was that they thought it would be good for their careers. And so the question then becomes, why are we all engaging in this behavior? Is it just to advance personal agendas, like to get our name in print and to sell more books like I'm doing right now? Or is it actually to improve public understandings of science or public understandings of history? And I think there's a real open question that history communication can answer, or at least start to answer, about what is the effect of all this stuff. And in my book, I found that one effect is not actually a public understanding of history getting any better, but rather the conflation of history with journalism, which I think has a lot of issues around it.
This podcast focuses on diplomacy, foreign affairs, diplomatic history. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the issue of e-history in relation to foreign policy. From a foreign policy perspective going forward, what are some of the challenges that e-history and its lack of complexity that we just kind of spoke about, or even accuracy for that matter, what does that create for the future and for future policymakers potentially?
Yeah, this book has actually been very well received so far within the diplomatic communities. And I've had conversations with ambassadors and people who serve in embassies overseas about this. Hope to be going overseas later this year to meet with people who are working on things like Russian disinformation campaigns in Lithuania and Poland, the Czech Republic, other places. I think there's a lot of frustration. There has been a lot of frustration over the past 15 to 20 years about the fact that the web is not expert-centric. In other words, it doesn't privilege expertise the way experts want their information to be privileged. And over the course of the past 20 years, you have seen whether it's government officials, scientists, scholars, even journalists, sort of pleading in the public sphere for people and web platforms to do something to privilege certain types of information and bury other types of information. But the web was not set up that way. And in some cases, it was purposely not set up that way, as is the case of Wikipedia or even Clubhouse, for example, where expertise is not privileged at all. So I think we perhaps need to start recalibrating our conversations a little bit. And thinking not about what the platforms don't do or how they've been sort of built and architectured in ways that don't privilege the type of people or the type of knowledge that we want to see privileged, but instead think about building in new incentives for the next iteration of the web and Web 3.0. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about and talking a lot about as I think about this book. So Web 2.0 has been built, as I said earlier, so much on this premise of speed and instant gratification. So, what if we built a future of the web that didn't incentivize or privilege speed, but rather privileged patience and thoroughness? Um, what if we could build a future of the web that privileged accuracy and actually gave people maybe accuracy scores or incentives or rewards from the algorithms for being accurate? Um, these maybe sound like sort of wildly optimistic or panacea type visions, but the future of the web is being built right now. And it's being built based on some of the assumptions that were baked into Web 2.0. And so, how do we start to have conversations that think differently and have different voices involved? And this is where I think scholars and diplomats and government need to be in conversation with engineers and venture capitalists in Silicon Valley as these new platforms are being built, so that it's not like these new platforms come out and all of a sudden we're caught off guard or have to learn on the fly how to use them, but rather there are more diverse perspectives at the table while the platforms are being envisioned and while the algorithms are being designed. And we can argue for different incentives to be baked into those algorithms so that when the products come out, they do different things than what Web 2.0 has done. So that's what I'm hoping will be one of the outcomes from this book and these various speaking engagements that I've been doing and conversations I've been having. And I do think it's possible. I do think that there's an appetite for that, but it's about, I think, building these networks and creating places where these types of dialogues can happen, and then building that trust between all these different stakeholders to create something that is better for the next 20 years than what we've seen over the previous 20 years.
Yeah, so that answers a little bit of the last question I was going to put to you about sort of the way forward. But we're still dealing with Web 2.0, and we will be for the foreseeable future. What advice or what would you say to a historian that's trying to navigate e-history and Web 2.0? What do you think is the sort of the best route forward on trying to deal with that? Do you wholeheartedly jump into it and participate in it? Do you stand away from it? Do you try to 1 foot in traditional history, 1 foot in e-history? What's your take on this over the long term until we get to Web 3.0, which is hopefully has some of these kinks fixed?
Well, my first advice would be to get involved with the History Communication Institute, which is a new institute that I'm setting up along with some colleagues, and that eventually, hopefully, ISD and Georgetown will be partners with. Because I think we need more spaces for these types of conversations. If you go to AHA or you go to OAH or you go to Schaefer, there'll be a podcasting panel or there'll be a blogging panel, but there really isn't a venue or a forum for this type of ongoing dialogue. And there isn't really a venue or a forum supporting this type of ongoing research. I was actually just talking with a scholar in Germany who's trying to do a project about history on TikTok and Instagram. And she was so relieved to find this book because she just couldn't find any other literature out there that really went into this topic with any depth. So I think we need to be in supporting people to do more of this type of research. And we need to be building community for people who want to engage with these questions. And that's hopefully what the HCI will do. We plan to offer funding in cryptocurrency for people who want to work in this area. And we also offer community through a monthly happy hour where we can talk about these issues. I don't think there's a one size fits all question. I think there are historians who have severe misgivings about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram because they are billion-dollar companies that ultimately are looking to return value to shareholders and extract as much data from us as possible. And some historians don't want to be part of that. And to be honest, I cannot blame them. So not everybody needs to be involved in this if they don't want to. I think there's a lot of different roles that historians can play. And being a great professor or being a great local museum curator who doesn't ever go on Facebook is certainly one of those roles. But if you do want to be involved in the sort of morass of Web 2.0 and social media, I think this book offers a few strategies and a few things to think about. And I hope that we'll continue to offer that to historians and others through the History Communication Institute.
All right, we'll get you out of here on perhaps a little lighter fare. But as you did the research for this book, I guess what was the most interesting or your favorite, not necessarily the same thing, sort of viral historical thing that you ran into looking at e-history?
I think the most challenging, but maybe the most rewarding chapter to write was actually the chapter on Instagram. And as someone who was not a huge Instagram user, to see how much history is being communicated across Instagram by different actors was fascinating and eye-opening. And also to see how this visually arresting past and how history memes get deployed in these tense political fights and media frenzies was really, really interesting. And it was really interesting to look at how progressives and social justice activists were responsible in many ways for spreading that misinformation, disinformation, and those historical imagery. Because I think what's happened over the Trump administration and beyond is that there has been this kind of assumption that misinformation and disinformation only affects the conservative side of the aisle. So basically, progressives and Democrats are so smart and so media literate that we never spread misinformation or disinformation. It's only Republicans and conservatives who do it. And if only we could shut off Fox News and get Dan Bongino off the air, we'd be fine. Well, I think my book disproves that. And I've always kind of felt that way, but I was interested to see the research and see where that went, because I think there's a lot of evidence that this spreading of misinformation and disinformation and the use of historical memes and historical imagery that are taken out of context, that are grabbed from Russian foreign actors or Iranian foreign actors or Chinese foreign actors and sort of fed into the social media ecosystem as a way to prove a point or show that you're on the right side of history, quote unquote, is done by a lot of different actors with a lot of different agendas, including progressives and Democrats and social justice activists and the rest. So that was a really interesting and important chapter to write, and one that was challenging, but also felt really good once I got it down on paper and kind of edited it and refined it to a place where I thought it was telling a good and valuable story.
Yeah, not necessarily the lighter fare I was going for there, but that works nonetheless. And I did like that chapter a lot because, again, I'm not very active on Instagram at all. Don't really look at it. But, at first blush, I was kind of like, oh, this is going to be, interesting to see how he talks about Instagram at all for history, right? It's like it's the written word, this history stuff that we look at. But then I found it to be very interesting. And I agree with you completely on this mischaracterization of the right and conservatives with misinformation and disinformation. I think people of all political persuasions are equal opportunity spreaders of misinformation and disinformation. So I think that's something extremely important to keep in mind, and so that all folks know that they need to look at that and think about things and think about context and framing and where you're getting things and all that sort of stuff. So, but on that note, Jason, I want to thank you for joining us today. And once again, the book is called History Disrupted: How Social Media and the World Wide Web Have Changed the Past. Thanks a lot for joining us, Jason.
Thank you, guys. This was fun.
That was Diplomatic Community. Thanks for listening to this episode. Please share the episode on social media and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us wherever they listen to podcasts. This episode was produced by Alistair Somerville. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. Until we meet again.